Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. Harris Ranch Resort, providing Western hospitality and award-winning cuisine. The Wonderful Company, committed to growing a better world. Comcast, connecting people to the moments and experiences that matter most. Producers Dairy, nourishing one life at a time. And Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Cook Land Company and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Blake Zante.
Welcome to the Maddy Report. I'm Blake Zante, Executive Director of the Maddy Institute and host of the Maddy Report. Today, we'll be looking at the 2024 primary election in California, and more specifically, voter turnout in that election. With California Secretary of State set to certify the election by April 12, 2024, the most recent estimates put voter turnout at approximately 35% statewide. In some places in the Central Valley, voter turnout was even lower than the statewide percentage. Joining us today to help unpack this is Fresno County Clerk and Registrar of Voters, James Coos. Mr. Coos, thank you for joining us on the show today.
Glad to be here.
Honored to have you. So could you briefly explain your role as County Clerk?
So in Fresno County, the County Clerk is an elected position covering clerk services, Registrar of Voters, and also records management for the county. Clerk services are basic general services for citizens of the county, providing fictitious business names, marriage licenses, passport services, and it does take up a good portion of our regular daily processes. The other major portion is Registrar, where we maintain local registration records for the state. The state is actually the official holder of registration in California. And then we put on elections for our jurisdiction, for the state, and for our local jurisdictions. So we are the elections officer for just about everyone in the county of Fresno. A few of the cities contract through us, but generally speaking, we're the ones who do the work.
That's great, and that's a big portion of why we're here today, of course, to talk about that big portion of your role as the Registrar of Voters. And so we've just gone through a primary election. Can you kind of walk us through what does that ballot counting process look like for the county of Fresno?
So with a major statewide election, with any election, we actually send out ballots beginning 45 days ahead, but for most voters, 29 days ahead. And ballots start coming back right away. We will have our first ballots back 28 days, 4 weeks before the election, and that will continue all the way up to election day. We close the polls at 8 o'clock, but we still get ballots for a week after that in California. Vote by mail ballots that are postmarked by election day are received all the way up to 1 week afterwards. As soon as we start getting ballots, we begin that ballot tabulation process. And the first step usually is to review, compare a signature on a return envelope. 90% of ballots in Fresno County are returned by vote by mail. So most of our ballots go through that process. We open up in-person voting at the same time, and then at our vote centers about 10 days beforehand. We have tabulators right there in the field. So we have 2 different ways that we're tabulating. In the field for in-person voters, and then a central count for that 90% that use the vote by mail process. We go all the way up through that election day. We try to get as many results out as we can election night, but we still oftentimes have as many as 50% of ballots returned on election day or even in the mail after that. So it does take a little while for us to get all the way through all those ballots and report a final result.
Certainly, and you know, kind of as we're talking a little bit about how many ballots came back and were returned. I know we want to get into that a little bit, but is that process specific to the county of Fresno, or typically do other counties operate the same way, or do they handle it the same way?
So in California, and then federal law too, we have the elections code, and that lays out some very specific codes that you must follow in exact ways of how to design a ballot and materials along that way. But it also allows a fair bit of leeway. And so of the 58 counties in California, we all do our elections just a little bit different. We're all following the same rules, but each of us is going to appear slightly different. So the ballot may have a different font, it may have a different shape, may be done with a different company. But the general process of sending out a vote by mail ballot, receiving that back, or interacting with a voter at a voting location, giving them a ballot, receiving that ballot back, and then tabulating all of our ballots. The general process is the same throughout, but every county is a little unique in the way they do it. And the goal there is to really provide the best service to your county. County like Fresno is different than LA, is different than San Francisco, is different than Kings or Madera. So we do need to provide services in a slightly different manner or provide more services. And so we do end up with a little unique, and we may take a little longer in Fresno County in our approach than maybe Madera or Kings, but we're trying to provide the best service possible for our voters.
Sure. And with Fresno County being so geographically diverse, with having mountains over in the East County to more rural parts over in the west side of Fresno, and of course our cities all placed throughout. I mean, what are some of those services unique to Fresno County that you provide?
So Fresno County is now a California Voters' Choice Act county, have been since 2020. And for those, we use a vote center model, which is a limited number of locations, and a voter can visit at any of those locations. We have those vote centers going all the way from those foothills in the east, Bear Mountain Library or the Prather Sierra High School area, all the way out into our western foothills in Coalinga and the small towns out in the toe of the boot of Fresno County in Coalinga and Mendota. And we have different sizes and different lengths of time that they're open and available, but we make them accessible in all those locations. And you don't have to go to your neighborhood location anymore. If you live in Coalinga but work in Fresno, you can go to a vote center in Fresno and provide that service here.
Great. Well, thanks, James, for helping us understand the ballot process a little bit. Up next, we'll discuss some voting trends such as voter turnout and take a closer look at the recent special election. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with James Coos, Fresno County Clerk and Registrar of Voters. Now I'd like to dive into some of the voting trends that we've seen in this past March 2024 primary election. So, Mr. Coos, what are some of the significant trends that you've noticed in your role in this election?
Well, as you mentioned, for the state, we're at about 35% turnout. Fresno County, we're actually only about 31%. And that is not uncommon for Fresno to actually lag behind the state as a whole, and particularly lagging behind the Bay Area or some of the more active northern counties. We have noticed a number of count of voters have actually been relatively consistent, but our registration has gone up over the last several election cycles. So if you got the same number of voters, but the number of people who could vote have been going up, your participation number goes down. And so it looked worse than it might be in Fresno County. Additionally, I gotta say, it wasn't a lot of excitement at the top of the ballot. That's more for a political scientist to kind of tell you, but when you don't have a contest at the top of the ballot to really bring people in, we see participation go down.
Now, you mentioned that. Are there any contested local elections that you're still sort of, sorting out in your role?
We actually have one contest that is going to recount. We have certified the results. We did that on March 29th, but we have one contest, a measure in the city of Orange Cove, where a request for recount has been received, and this Wednesday we'll begin that process. We'll do a manual tally of all 538 ballots in that contest, because the contest was actually really decided only by 2 or 3 votes, and that's one of those times when every vote matters, and so we're going to go in and take a look at that.
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone's contesting whether their vote matters, that's a great case study to present to them. Speaking of which, there have been a lot of other interesting elections that we've had in Fresno County. Some residents received 2 ballots this year for certain elections. Could you tell us a little bit about what that was and maybe dive into that process a little bit?
Yeah, along with our presidential primary election, we also had a special election in Congressional District 20 because we had a vacancy when Congressman McCarthy left his position. That meant that a quarter of the county received 2 ballots within 2 weeks of each other because we couldn't really put those 2 elections together because of election law. We did not have a majority winner in that special election, so we actually have a redo, a general version of that, a runoff in that Congressional District 20 special election on May 21st. So those voters have a 3rd ballot on the way to them right now. So a lot of ballots that are out there. In any election situation, a small number of voters 1 to 2% in Fresno County will receive a second ballot because they re-register, they change address or change name. This past presidential election, we also had a lot of party changes, and those required a update, a sending of a new ballot. So a fair number of voters that did have multiple ballots received, almost always intentionally.
And how common is that process? Do you see that typically from election to election, or is this pretty abnormal, would you say?
It's actually very common. As I said, 1 to 2% always because of updates to registration. By law, if you change your name, you change your address, we do need to send you a new ballot. Sometimes folks aren't really paying attention at the DMV and they've updated information and they're going to get a new ballot coming to them. So this is a constant. It was a bit higher because it was a presidential primary and party mattered. Most of the time, party doesn't matter. How you were registered doesn't matter in the top two system that California uses. But for a presidential primary, it absolutely did matter.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we're kind of coming to the end of our interview here, but what's something that you'd like all of the Fresno County voters and Valley voters to know about the election process, especially as we're heading into the November general election?
Every vote counts. Get your vote in early. We do have our vote centers there ready to help anyone who wants to vote in person who needs assistance. I really recommend for the November general election, coming in early. We have vote centers open 10 days before Election Day. There will be lines on Election Day, so we really want folks to come in when we've got the time to help you out and we're not being rushed.
Absolutely. And where can voters go if they have questions?
All of our vote center information is available online at our website at votefresnocounty.com or by giving us a call at 559-600-8683.
Fantastic. Well, Mr. Koofs, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate having you on the
Pleasure.
show. Thank you. Up next on the Maddy Report, we'll be discussing voter turnout from a statewide perspective. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. We talked about voter turnout in the March primary election specific to Fresno County in the Central Valley. Now joining us to provide a statewide perspective is Dr. Mindy Romero from the USC Price School of Public Policy. Dr. Romero, welcome to the Maddy Report. Thank you for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Thanks so much. So could you tell us a little bit about your role at the USC Price School of Public Policy and a bit about your background that led you here?
Sure. Well, I'm faculty at the Price School of Public Policy. I also direct a center that I founded called the Center for Inclusive Democracy. And other than that, I'm involved in many different things on campus and off.
That's great. Well, I definitely want to dive in to hear a little bit about your thoughts on voting in the primary and midterm elections and also in the general election coming up. What types of trends do you see in these elections?
Yeah, well, there's lots of different things that we could talk about, right? One thing that I always focus on in my work, the Center for Inclusive Democracy, is just trying to understand both the level of participation, how robust are our elections, how many people are actually, casting a ballot, engaged, hopefully even beyond just casting a ballot, right? Being informed and caring and feeling like their vote matters. And then also beyond just participation, what's the state of representation? Does the voting electorate, those who are actually casting a ballot in any given election, whether it's high or low turnout, does it actually look like, is it representative of the overall population, whether it be California, whether it be a county within California like Fresno, or whether it be the United States? If your viewers didn't know, just as a nation, the U.S. has some of the lowest turnout rates of established democracies around the world. That's always pretty much a given. We know we're going to have lower turnout than other countries. And any given election in the United States, whether it's kind of high for what we normally would expect or low, we also know that it's going to be the population that's voting is going to be not representative of the overall population. And the question is just, did we get a little better? Did we have maybe more voters of color, more voters from historically underrepresented groups, more young people, for instance? Did the electorate, did it kind of improve in terms of its level of representation? And I know no matter what election I'm looking at, I know the question is maybe a little bit in terms of improvement around that representation question, but a consistent trend is that we have turnout that's probably lower than most people want to see it in a robust democracy, certainly compared to the rest of the world. And then here, even in our state, even in our diverse state like California, we know that the turnout is going to be it's going to be lower for people of color, lower for young people, lower for people with limited English proficiency. That the overall the electorate at any given time is going to be older, wealthier, whiter. And that has real consequences in terms of outcomes, right? People's policy preferences can vary by group, by life circumstances, by life chances. And when an electorate is not representative of the population, you have a select group, a very select group, that are making choices for everybody else. And we don't take policy positions in our center or at our center, but we know that a democracy, a robust democracy, should have a representative electorate. And we study, track, engage in research that is about trying to understand the state of the electorate, the state of engagement, by the way, more broadly also, beyond just voting, and how we can improve people's participation, the factors for why we have low turnout or lower turnout or disparate turnout, and how we can ultimately, hopefully, get to the promise of a robust democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know similarly at the Maddy Institute, we're a nonpartisan institute, but we agree that citizen participation and engagement are definitely critical. And as you stated, participation is linked to representation. So I want to get into that a little bit. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. We're talking with Dr. Mindy Romero from the USC Price School of Public Policy. Here's some factors that influence participation in an election.
Yeah, and this is really important, right? Because some people, including policymakers, right, who can maybe change some of the factors, will kind of start by looking at those lower turnout numbers or those disparate turnout numbers by group and make assumptions that maybe the reason why young people, for instance, have lower turnout rates is something about young people. There's something wrong with young people, right? They're not engaged, they don't care, things like that. We'll hear that all the time. And I think what's really important is to emphasize what you just said. There are indeed factors, and most of them are systemic or outside the individual's kind of control, or at least influence how the individuals or groups feel about potentially voting or potentially participating. So if I'm going to predict low turnout, I know just demographically, somebody who is of color, somebody who is low income or from a low income background, who is less educated, somebody who's young, somebody who's a renter, for instance, right? That's all of those demographic categories, if you will, all predict lower turnout. But the real question is, okay, why are those groups, right, producing or experiencing lower turnout? And we know that systemically, there's a long history of our electoral system being set up and functioning in a way that disadvantages, for instance, young people. The fact that our registration system is, until very recently in our state, has been tied to an address. It still is tied to an address formally. And that has disadvantaged young people who are a very mobile population. There's other reasons for low turnout amongst young people too. So there's all kind of the institutional structural barriers. And then there are kind of motivational barriers. So people who maybe don't participate or struggle with thinking about whether they're going to participate because they feel like their vote doesn't matter. And a lot of times we'll hear that kind of pushed into the apathy category. Oh, people just don't care. What's wrong, right, with young people, the sleeping giant Latino, community, that kind of thing. And really, there's very little true apathy. What we understand from our research and research of others is that for most people that don't participate, or for groups that are more likely to not participate, there can be just higher levels of concern, right, that their vote doesn't matter. There can be higher levels of feeling disconnected from the political process for very real reasons, right? Historically, maybe in a community, like in the Central Valley, for instance, maybe a long history of some communities not seeing themselves represented on board of supervisors or city councils or whatever it might be, a long history of candidates and campaigns not reaching out to communities, at least in a real, sincere, effective way. Indeed, the significant differences in outreach that candidates and campaigns conduct by group is a big factor. So there's these structural reasons, and then we know that the biggest producer of outreach, the way our electoral system is designed is really candidates and campaigns, right? It's not the nonprofit groups who do great work, but they only have so many resources. The entities that are touching voters the most, if you will, are candidates and campaigns, and they are only reaching out. They're spending their resources in a very strategic, using a very strategic model of voting to identify the people that they think are going to be most likely to vote, using the biggest bang for their campaign buck. And they will not reach out to whole swaths of the registered voter population, even because they either don't think they need those votes because maybe it's a safe district, or because they've calculated that they'd rather use their campaign dollars for high propensity voters, frequent voters, versus less likely voters. And so we end up having this kind of cycle of communities that often don't get outreach to in the same way, or if at all, and they don't vote. And then they show up in the numbers as not voting as much. And so in those likely voter models, they don't get picked up, and the vicious cycle kind of continues. So just recognizing how the electoral system really produces disconnection. And then, of course, there's things like money in politics and the disconnect that people feel just from, in the issues that their political candidates talk about can often be quite significant for historically underrepresented groups. And so in the end, you have people that don't vote that often it's quite a rational decision, right? Because they don't know if their vote is actually going to be an actionable step on things that they care about. And so they do other things in their communities that they care about. Or maybe sometimes they don't vote because they're fearful that they're going to make a mistake. And it's because they're actually being very conscientious and care so much, but they don't know if they're picking between the lesser of two evils in their mind, or they just don't have enough information. And information, even in the information age, is not equally accessible across groups. We have seen that over and over again, not just from the information from candidates, but just the information kind of at large around the electoral system. And so that can also be a barrier. So I'll stop there. But lots of factors that contribute over and over again, election after election, to seeing these disparate trends.
Certainly, and there are a lot of factors, as you shared, and I'm sure we'll see a lot of those played out in the November general election. Dr. Romero, I want to thank you for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts and your perspective. This is the Maddy Report. To learn more about the Maddy Institute, visit maddyinstitute.com. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next week. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.com.